It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Gregory, Stella, too many names, so I'm going to read them. Maryam, Foradi, Lent, and Maryam Moritz from the University Leipzig, from the Humboldt Chair and DH Center at the University. And then we'll be presenting about dynamic syllabi for historical language instruction. So I will just leave it to you.
Thank you all very much, and I will start this hydra-headed presentation and talk as briefly and as quickly as I possibly can to try to leave as much time for the actual people doing the work. But I'd like to start by saying, so first of all, I guess contractually, I have to point to this really little print, and this is ESF, which I thought for months was the European Science Foundation. It turns out it's the European Social Fund. Which is funding us, and the Sächsische Aufbaubank, which we're driving crazy with our many changes and our non-standard activities, but has been very supportive of us, and so they are our sponsors and pay for all the salaries of everyone here except me. And our project, of which this is a part, is called the Reinvention of Humanities Publication. And this involves creating a large collection of open Greek and Latin resources, which is one thread. And it also involves integrating teaching and learning into the production process, because frankly, we have so damn much Greek and Latin now to work with that we need not only automated methods, but we also need to enlist our students as collaborators, and we need to draw on citizen scholars. This, which I thought was incredibly radical, and indeed it is, at least for Anglo-Saxon classics, the idea that a student could do something useful besides get things wrong, which is how we treat things, traditionally have treated things, turns out, of course, to be the realization or an attempt to realize Wilhelm von Humboldt's dream of what a university should be, where we are all here to produce new knowledge, and we are, insofar as we are consuming old knowledge, we are we're just at school. We're not at university. So it's a really deeply traditional thing, and in fact, a lot of what we're doing is a reassertion of very old and traditional values and practices in new forms. And I'm quite sure that the great philologists who shaped our field would have embraced these technologies with which we now work. I want to point out one other thing relevant to our project and relevant to this date. This is a very important date, and it's kind of a grim date. And it's an anniversary. 70 years ago tonight, in England, a squadron or a force of Lancaster bombers was getting ready to fly overnight, as they did. They came at night. They flew first to Berlin, drew up the Air Force, the forces up from the ground, and then they wheeled south to Leipzig. And in the early morning of December 4th, 1943, they basically took out the Grafisches Viertel. And nobody, it was a necessary thing, and unfortunately, 1,800 people died, some of whom would be alive today. But it was the kind of thing that happened. But it was also the end of the destruction of sort of one of the smallest things in the great scheme of things, but the Teubner Verlag, the greatest center of classical publication, was one of the physical casualties. You can now see the formal location is occupied by a Radisson Blue Hotel in Augustusplatz that we can see from our office. And the Teubner Verlag is, for me at least, a model, an inspiration in many ways. And our work is to try to rebuild in an open source, in an open data fashion for the 21st century in a global community, a new kind of sustainable publication and the production of knowledge. And so we are here, I am here in part because of the terrible things that have happened in our attempt to build something better. And the way we think about the teaching of Greek and Latin is in fact directly in line with a response to narrow nationalism and the use of antiquity to make your own particular nation seem best. That is something that will be a thread. Now, okay, I think that I grew up with a very distinct approach to how one thinks about reading Greek and Latin. And again, I come from the Anglo-Saxon world, and particularly the American world, so I don't thoroughly understand the culture here on this side of the channel. But basically, I think the real way people viewed things was if you didn't know enough Greek to read this text, you didn't really deserve to read it. Everything was, the notes were in Latin. The translation was for wimps who used the Loeb Classical Library, which was considered to be a shameful thing when I was an undergraduate, a sign of weakness. And I think that this focus on expertise, expertise is a good thing, really reflects traditions where the knowledge of Greek and Latin were surrogates or entry points into a privileged position, perhaps with the East India Company, so you could go, or with a national government, or in a law firm. And that is no longer the case for the study of Greek and Latin. And so that is a very problematic tradition for us. And the attitudes that we have about how we engage with the study of Greek and Latin and who studies Greek and Latin are things that we really need to rethink if we are to flourish, if not survive. I take great pleasure in talking about sort of teaching or issues regarding teaching Greek and Latin, because there is no subject that is more likely to destroy your career as a professional classicist than to be known for being interested in pedagogy. Perhaps the only thing that will be more quickly destroyed is if you're known for working on corpora. And those are the two things we work on. But I believe that some of the best research and most important research to be done for the study of Greek and Latin now lies with new methods of teaching and understanding how we learn Greek. Because we have new methods, new technologies, new research areas. So this, I think, would be a great area for a young person to think about when they're doing their research. Okay? So basically, texts can be annotated in such a way that you do not have to have studied the language to read them. Linguists do this all the time. It's not a new idea. Here's some intensive linguistic annotation by the brilliant Jesuit Athanasius Kircher from the 17th century. Your colleagues in Egyptology here in Berlin have resuscitated this, and they've applied the Leipzig glossing rules to ancient Egyptian, and we're doing the same thing for Greek and for Latin. The idea being that our job as people who know the language is to make it possible for people who do not know the language to do as much as they can. We are not there to restrict access, we are to promote access. And so this is, my colleague Giuseppe Celano is working on this, and at one level this is not rocket science. We know how to do it, we can do it today. I mean, we can make it work, but the problem is scalability. It's one thing to annotate every word in a small text. It is another thing to annotate 100 million words of Greek and Latin that survived through about 600 CE. And that is not going to happen by manual means. So the real question is, can we manage this in a way that is scalable? And the answer is yes. You have automated initial analysis that does a reasonable job, makes some mistakes, and then collaborative correction. And one of the threads is that students start by working with data that's been corrected with lots of feedback in what is essentially a gaming environment, and then they level up, a term that those of you who have children, all of your children know what that means. They will level up to the point where they're able to make their own contributions. And if you put several students together and they interacting about what is the answer to this, what's the answer to that, and you have enough conversation, you start to get pretty good data, and the data can get rapidly better as more and more people weigh in. Okay. And also, I think we're now at the point where every student in a university class who reads anything about the Greco-Roman world should, as a matter of course, assume they're going to work directly with Greek and Latin, not just with a German or English or Italian translation. It's, again, totally different from how we proceeded in my lifetime. And some subset of this group will choose to internalize knowledge of the language and I believe we'll get more students studying Greek and Latin. And those of you who don't have jobs yet, students mean jobs. Those of you who have tenure, you may not care. But if you want to be replaced, it's a good thing to have more students. All right, so what's new? What are some of the methods? And those of you who've been coming to these seminars, I'm not going to give you anything new here, probably. There's one method, or alignments between a source text and a translation. And they might look like that, where you have one word in the source text and then one or more words that are aligned to it. Many of you have seen interlinear translations in various languages for the bad old days when we needed to know Greek and Latin to get rich or to get a job. And that's a visualization of the same data. This kind of aligned translation can be done automatically or can be done by hand, and you can even generate translations that are aligned from the start. But these, you aggregate these things into parallel corpora where you statistically figure out which words co-occur and which words in the Greek correspond to which words in the English. And this is the foundation for many of our multilingual services. And so it's a pretty foundational thing. And I will say that I don't want any student ever to give me a translation to English, German, or any modern language that they have not aligned to the source text word by word and commented it to me when they cannot do the alignment, why they cannot. All right. And this is also obviously dependent on the language, the L1 of the learner. Just like the Graecum Latinum, you translate Greek into German. In Italy, you translate Greek into Italian. In Bulgaria, you translate into Bulgarian. And it's hard, and that's important because you want to get these languages into the different national languages. But how do you compare a Bulgarian and an Italian and a German? And this brings us to the other great tool, which is morphosyntactic analysis. Probably should be linguistic annotation more generally, where you might represent this information as a tree structure, basically saying subjects and objects, and this word depends on the other word in various ways. I have here text in Slovenian, and I use the text in Slovenian because I don't know Slovenian, but I want to make the point that I can tell you what the subject of the sentence is and what the adverbs are and so on because of this tagging. This is a reading aid as well. And you aggregate these things into tree banks, and tree banks are as close to a genome database as there is for language. And they are foundational to the study of certainly of ancient languages. And these are relatively independent of the L1 of the speaker. And we know that while you can traditionally you use translation at the highest level, like in a PhD exam, you make people translate to see if they understand the language. But we also know we have preliminary data to suggest that, in fact, if you're really good at morphosyntactic analysis, if you can build those trees accurately and quickly, you could also translate. That means we have this method is the same whether you speak Lithuanian, Hungarian, English, or German. The tree is going to look the same. And it means you have one space in which students can collaborate to produce useful data, but where you can also document that perhaps the best student of Greek or in the world might be at the University of Cairo in the Department of Greek and Latin Studies, even though nobody can read that person's Arabic translation. Where people can have the chance for communities to emerge across national boundaries. All right. And so both of these processes also have outputs. We need a lot of translations. We need a lot of open translations. We need a lot of well-aligned translations. Not just in English, German, you can say, well, it's all there multiple times. Not so much if you're in Bulgarian or Croatian or Polish. And remember, all of your secondary school education normally takes place in the natural language. I'm going to finish up here in about 1 minute, I hope. This was the centerpiece to undergraduate education in Greek and Latin in the United States. A reading list that told you what you were responsible for, no matter how often you found some lazy professor who was drunk all the time and would give you an A- for not doing much work, which was the great skill when I was an undergraduate. Nevertheless, you would be examined on this reading list at the end of the day, and this kept you honest. And this reading list, this is the last reading list left for undergraduates in the United States. And my hypothesis is that the university that has this reading list has it there because they're not interested in what the students are doing, and they just leave it there and not worry about it. Even Harvard gave up on its reading list because the students couldn't do it anymore. It has about 140,000 words of running text, and the idea is you master that. And it could be Greek and Latin, or it could be Greek or Latin, but 140,000 words. And this is beyond the capacity of our students in the United States. It is no longer a part of any program except Yale. And now this reading list is rigid. It's the same for everybody. It never changes. It's a tyrant. And what the hell's in there? What does that mean? Intellectually, you know what that means. But what really does that mean? Where did I get that 140,000 words? Well, I got it because all these words are in a dynamic in a corpus. And they've been lemmatized, and we can analyze the vocabulary now, and we know something about what the vocabulary is, how big the corpora are, and we can start to analyze the complexity as well. But here, if you read 50,000 or so words and master them, then you recognize 96% of the words on the next page you read, which means you're approaching the point where you could actually read the language. But this, if we have a dynamic syllabus, you're able to think about having customized reading lists. Someone wants to work in philosophy. Somebody wants to work on Christian literature. Somebody wants to work on epic. And you can have different reading lists. You know exactly what's in it. People can document what they've mastered, and you can examine them on it. It changes the nature of how you represent what you've learned, and makes it possible to move to portfolios away from grades. We need customization, personalization, and localization. We'll talk a bit about that. And we're going to have a customized course. Basically, we need smart textbooks that adapt to the materials you actually want to learn, as opposed to giving you some generic textbook, one size fits all. And our first dynamic textbook will be to teach you Thucydides. The real reason for this is that I really like Thucydides. But the excuse is Thucydides does not have a tree bank. A big tree bank has a small one, about which you've heard in this forum. And it has a lot of sort of basic resources. So it demonstrates that you can get started with a finite amount of labor. And Thucydides has cross-curriculum appeal. It has really smart people working with it who do not want to become philologists, like historians and political philosophers. Here's a visualization of what happens with a customized textbook. This is the 8 books of Thucydides, and sort of seen it grossly. Each column is a book. And this here, every period every green word is a word where a student has learned the vocabulary entry and they've learned the morphology. Every blue word is a form where the students know the morphology. They know it's a dative singular. They don't know what it means yet. And the periods are words about which they know nothing. That's where you stand after 2 weeks, really after your first class when you've learned astem nouns in Greek. And the idea is that immediately, you are seeing your progress applied to a real text. And every time you learn something, you see the impact of what you have learned, which means don't learn the future perfect. And actually in Thucydides, he hardly ever uses the second person singular. So that's kind of an interesting pedagogical question. Also, if you have a line text, you say, okay, how long does it take? What does sumphora mean? It says in the textbook it means an event. In Thucydides, if you look at how it's translated, it always means a catastrophe or a misfortune. And these are automatic alignments. And so you see in one case, the alignment wasn't made. That's an exercise for the students. But again, you go right into the text, and you're not given a textbook answer. You're given a real data. That's what we want to support. So we're going to shift, and I'm going to hand this over to the people who are actually doing the work. So I talked a little too long and describe the hand waving. And now I'm going to have my colleagues who are doing the real work get up and talk about globalization and localization, which is basically supporting languages for local learners, the user experience for e-learning, which involves language-independent functions and games, graphs, and data. And this is why you classicists can't just amble up with your SQL database and make this happen and have it function. Why you need someone who thinks like a computer scientist, and why do you need global, localization? Well, Latin and Greek are taught across Europe, and we have to cover at least 24 languages. We want a single infrastructure, 24 languages, and that's just the beginning. So Maryam Foradi will now come on and take over. And Maryam is getting a PhD in translation studies with us at Leipzig, and will describe her work.
So I'm Maryam Foradi. I come from Iran. As Professor Crane mentioned, my background is in translation studies, and I have no background in classics. As I met Professor Crane, I tried to be very impressive and tell him that I'm very interested in learning ancient languages, and of course I'm interested, but he told me, it's the point. I want you to learn ancient languages and record and track your learning process for using it in our project. I want to talk about three parts of this project which I'm working in. And the first one is localization. I want to define localization, but I cannot do it without defining globalization, which is the super context of localization. So globalization is the process of making all necessary technical, financial, managerial, and other things for making international businesses. But the globalization have a negative association, which need to be, so as a disambiguation, I need to clarify that we are not talking about globalization as taking the identity of the different cultures and make all the same, but also we want to go deeply through with each culture, with each native language, and then provide materials for each language that are suitable for learning historical languages. And I want to quote Emily Greenwood here and say that we are using the phrase omnilocal instead of globalization. But why we want to be global? Because historical languages are global. I want to have some arguments. The first one is the Baghdad movement of translations. As you know, in 1800 to 800 to 1000 10th century, the ancient Greek works were translated into Arabic, and it had an important role of survival of ancient Greek works, because they have been retranslated in the in 12th century and 13th century to Latin, and not only the translation but also the influence of the ancient Greek words on the Orient philosophers like Mulla Sadra or Avicenna, who was not only philosopher but also a medical doctor, and these influences are again translated in Latin. So we see the impact of ancient word on the Orient, and then again the impact and the influence of Orient on the Western world. And I want to talk about another modern example that we can mention here, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran constitution. Maybe you know, maybe not, that the constitutional law of Iran is based on the Republic of Plato. And so, as I don't know if you can see here, this number 7 is about concils, which is talking about the concile guard or the role of supreme leader in the government. So all of them are based on the book Republic of Plato. So going further with globalization, the globalization consists of two parts, which are internationalization and localization. Internationalization is the process of enabling a product at a technical level for localization, and localization is the process of modifying the product or service for distinct markets. Localization has 4 issues. The first one is linguistic issues, and I want to go deeper with this issue with some examples. The examples I have chosen is the comparison of Persian and Croatian about learning the language, about the content of materials that we are providing for the learners who want to learn ancient Greek. So, as we want to explain, for example, for the learners what are cases or what is dative case, it's not just talking how we can build, how we can produce this case, or how is the morphology of these cases. For Croatian speakers, it shouldn't be so difficult because they have 7 cases in their language, although they don't have any articles, but they understand what are the cases. But for a Persian speaker, in specific, concretely, you need to explain what exactly a dative case is, and then going through and explain how you can build it. Or, and I should mention for Bulgarian, for example, they don't have even cases and not articles. The other example is participles. So Iranian people have participle in the language, but Croatian doesn't have any. So it's vice versa. You should explain them what is participle and what's the function of participle and how you can produce participles. The other issues I want to talk about are physical ones, cultural and technical issues. So the physical issues are about the shape of the product. So as our environment is a ritual one, I want to skip this issue and go to the cultural, which is very important for our work. Cultural issues are related to everything you offer to the learners. It could be colors, icons, and so on. And it's important, and I say why with an example. So you can imagine when you have a learning environment and you want to tell the learner he was successful in this exercise, and you give thumbs up and everybody can understand it. Yes, you were successful, but for Iranian people, thumbs up is something like giving middle finger, and you think about it. So, yes, you were successful. So it wouldn't work for Iranian people. The next issue I want to talk about is technical issue. Technical issues are everything that you do in technical level. Example for that is left to right direction or right to left direction for the speakers like Arabic or Persian and so on, or date formats. So as you know, the speakers of Western languages scan a web page in an F shape. So it means that they do it, the header from left to right and then up to bottom and then the next line. But of course, for the speakers of Arabic or Persian, it wouldn't be so. And it's not just about writing the letters, but also about floating the elements, because it's important to have the most relevant element at the first, that the speaker can, or the learner can scan it in the right way. The other example is date formats. So in Europe, today is 3rd of December 2013, and in US too, but as you see, it's the different way of writing. So, and it could be very confusing for the European people to figure out what exactly this date means. But it's good because in Islamic countries today is 29th of the first month, 1435, And Iran, if you read from right to left, today is the 12th day of 9th month of 1392. And if my converter works correctly, today is the first day of 11th month, 4711 in China. And we could be sure that they don't write in this way that I have written. The next topic I'm working with is about tree banking, which is almost an language independent issue, but we cannot say that's not important, because before going through translation, which is the other part of my work, the students need to understand the syntax and the morphology of a sentence correctly, and then they can start with translating. So tree banking, which is a language independent work, helps us to understand the structure of a sentence, and the annotations you see here can are the morphosyntactic analysis of the sentence. So the students will be able to go through and have a good sense of the sentence and go through and getting ready for translations. So when we are talking about translations, you cannot avoid translating to your own native language as you are learning a foreign language. It's a fact. And when we accept this fact, then we can use it and say, okay, we begin with dynamic learning, with translation. As Professor Craig mentioned before, our reading text is right now Thucydides, and I won't go through with this example. So you are reading Thucydides, you start translating Thucydides, and then you have a word or a phrase that you haven't seen it before, or you didn't have it in your module in the order of your lessons. So you dynamically, so you go to this part of the modules and you learn about it, or not. So second person singular almost will never show up in Thucydides, and maybe you want to learn about it, so you skip Thucydides and go to your module and start learning Thucydides. And the point I should refer to is that we want to go deeper than localization, and what we want to have personalized in learning environment. Monica will talk about it later. So using translation maybe has this association that we want to go back to the grammar translation method, which is an old-fashioned method and is expired. But new studies show that we cannot avoid translating during the learning of languages. So, but as long as it's not the method, but also the tool, as we are working with, so we combine this tool with other tools and use them in our learning environment. Here you see some screenshots of our alignment environment. The first one is the literary English, the good old English one, and the second one is the literal English. So we try to translate the Greek text word for word in order that the students and the user can understand which word is equivalent to which word in Greek, and as they click over this word, so they see the exact meaning in English, or in the third example, they will see it in Persian. So we are not talking about literary translation, but also about literal translation. The Scopus theory, very famous theory in translation studies, tells us that the translations should be adequate for the audience, and they don't really need to look for equivalences for each word. But I want to use this theory here and say, and because that we have an adequate translation for our audience, we make literal translation, because they need to have word for word translations in order to understand and have a good sense of the Greek text. So translation is here one of the skills that you use it for developing the understanding of the language you're learning. And so when you are fit in translations, now it's the point to start translating by yourselves, and it's very important because we need many new translations in many languages. The example for that is Persian. So Iranian constitutional law is based on Plato, and it's interesting to know that there is no direct translation from Greek to Persian. So it's the time that we provide materials for the learners that they can understand the text, and they can start translating the text from the source language into their target language as they log in our environment system and start collaborative translating as non-anonymous individuals. I want to finish the part of my part of the talk with an open question. So as I mentioned before, my task was start learning Greek and record my learning process. And one of my observations was that as I started to work with all our extensive materials, I have seen that it's too easy for me to translate the Greek text into Persian, and it shouldn't be so. And then I have seen, okay, I have so many materials. I have dictionaries, I have morphosyntactic analysis, and I have parallel text in English. And actually, I'm translating from English to Persian and not from Greek. And I'm not really learning Greek. So the question is, how do you internalize knowledge of the language? Now I give the floor to Monica Lent, my colleague, and she will talk about front end and user experience.
All right. As Maryam said, I'm Monica Lent. I'm from the United States, and my background is in user experience design and front-end web development. So my topic is going to be kind of tying together what Maryam has talked about with localization and the back end that Maria will talk about, and how these come together in a way that is meaningful for the end user. And I'll give a brief introduction to what exactly user experience means and some of the considerations we will take into account when designing the user experience for our e-learning system. So first and foremost, the user experience describes how the user feels when they're using our system. So there are a lot of ways that we can make this a positive and productive experience for them. A big factor being usability. We have to consider, okay, this is the first time a user may be using an e-learning environment. They may not have cognitive models for some of the new things that they have to do. So we need to make new features able to be discovered by them within the interface. System performance is also important because no one likes waiting for a slow website. So we have to indicate when things are going to take a long time and do our best to avoid that. Accessibility, we want to enable people with a wide variety of backgrounds and abilities to learn historical languages. So we don't want to exclude anyone. A big part of this is localization, which means that we don't presume you're necessarily coming from English in order to learn a historical language. And another example of accessibility is device independence, so to speak. We want people who are using mobile devices and tablets, or who are coming from Mac, PC, or a variety of browsers. We don't want to exclude anyone from being able to learn a historical language. Utility and graphic design kind of go hand in hand. We want to make the interface look good, but we don't want to detract from its functionality. Interaction design is one of the most interesting parts of the e-learning user experience because we're going to be teaching people interactions with the machine that they've completely never done before. An example of this that you may be familiar with is using a smartphone. Before the advent of smartphones, you never had thought about, okay, how do I refresh a news feed with my hands, or how do I scroll in, and now the pinch to zoom or whatever. It's ubiquitous, and it's natural to us, and we expect to use it on a variety of devices. In the same way, we want to make the learning interactions, such as building parse trees, second nature to people, so that the interface is just so easy to use that it becomes enjoyable and natural for them to do. And lastly, marketing. And by marketing, I don't mean selling people things they don't need. I mean knowing who our audience is, and that philologists aren't our only audience. We want to appeal to a wide range of people, such as historians or political scientists or even non-academics. Anyone should be able to use the system to learn historical languages. So nextly, I'm going to talk about some of the interesting challenges that we will get to encounter as we build the system. The first of which is that we have a rather lofty goal of not just teaching people historical languages, but learning how they learn it best. And we realize this isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. So one of the great things is that because our database will support this, we can really see what is working for different people. And this is something that we'll be able to use metrics to decide, as opposed to pure observation and just guessing. So that's one strength and a challenge. Nextly, using novel interactions required for novel learning tasks. So we have to keep in mind that people with classical educations may have never built a parse tree in their whole life, even if they're totally proficient in ancient Greek or Latin. So we want to teach them these skills alongside the grammar that they're learning. And lastly, as I mentioned with the know your audience bit, we realize that people have different learning goals. So not everyone wants to read Thucydides, or not everyone wants to become a philologist or feel like they have to know every bit of the grammar in order to get at this text. So this is another one of our upcoming challenges. And then some opportunities. There are a lot of things we can do because this is a virtual environment and not a traditional classroom. So for instance, we can personalize a user's learning experience and go beyond customization. An example of personalization versus customization would be if you went on Amazon.com and before you make any purchases, they ask you, so what kind of things are you interested in? How about you fill out this long list and just tick all these boxes? You know everything you could ever want to buy, right? Firstly, no one would ever do that because it's a pain, it takes up time, and it's just not effective. Whereas we see from their model, okay, they pay attention to what have you bought in the past, what have you looked at, and what have other people like you looked at? And we want to kind of take this idea and apply it to learning. What are your individual strengths as a learner? What are you struggling with? And what are people who are like you going to benefit the most from? So that's something that's really great that we can do because we have a virtual system. Secondly, we provide detailed and immediate feedback for users. So when a user is submitting a tree that they've done, we can find out, okay, here are the areas that you're struggling with. Maybe you want to review this lesson. So we can do this on such an individual and immediate basis. That's really important. And then lastly, because the big point that we're trying to make is that you can start from day one in a text that you care about, as opposed to waiting at least a year and a half, 2 years before you get to read anything besides really simple textbook stories. So one way of bringing this back is that you visualize the user's progress in that text and how the lessons themselves are kind of unlocking that text for them and making it more available. Maybe they can see which sections they're really making progress on because this visualization gives that to them. And nextly, I'm going to show a couple of ideas and ways that we'll approach these user experience considerations. The first of which is showing what it might look like for a user to come into our system. So we base our current textbook on a traditional Greek textbook and divide the learning materials into sections. But one consideration we have is that people are on the internet. They're not necessarily in a classroom. So do we necessarily have 50 minutes of their undivided attention? You know, that depends on you know, how focused they are. So instead, we want to make sure that we divide all of the sections into easy to digest pieces that can be done in one sitting, so people won't leave and come back, that it really holds their attention. And this is a great example of why localization is important, because this interface is clearly designed for left to right readers. But the code is written in a way that it's very simple to move things and float the elements in a way that it will make sense for speakers of Persian, for instance. Next. All right, and this is an example of what you can see if you are going to start a new lesson. It tells you what new material you're going to encounter. So because we take the data about the textbook and we teach them the most important words, the most important forms, then you make huge progress in the beginning because you're, you know, really focusing on the text. And this is really encouraging, and it makes the text accessible so much sooner. Next, we want to provide several levels of visualization for the target corpus, depending on what the user needs. So at the top level, it's a bit hard to see, but you'll be able to download these slides later, I'm sure, that we have the text as a whole, showing your layers of knowledge, so to speak. So if you know, we use vocabulary, syntax, and morphology as 3 layers of understanding for a word. And as you learn more, then in the top visualization, the saturation of the color increases. So it like fills in as you are learning more about these words. And the next one is a more detailed view, which shows really the shape of the text, and the last one gets you even closer ultimately to the text itself, and you can see how what you've learned is making particular phrases available to you, and you can further explore the words that you're interested in or that you want to learn about. Lastly, new interactions for new kinds of learning. This is exciting because we want to introduce tree banking and building parse trees very early on, so it becomes comfortable and natural as they're learning the grammar itself. So then another exciting part about this is that we can give them specific corrections and really coach them through this process in an automated way. So that's kind of like one of the interesting ways that we get to create a new experience for the user. And of course, creating this on mobile and tablet is going to be an extra interesting challenge. Yeah, so lastly, once we have more data about how people are using the system and we have users in the system, we'll be able to use these metrics to discover patterns and learn about how people retain the material. Do people who do certain kinds of exercises more than others tend to retain that material longer? There are a lot of exciting questions that we can start to look at and use this information ultimately to personalize the interface and experience more closely for individual users. And furthermore, to use the annotated text to give people near infinite examples of things that they're interested in. So if the user wants to know how a specific word is often used, they can use these materials to get more grammatical constructions and more examples. And as we go forward, provide text besides just Thucydides for people to learn from. So those are some of the exciting things to come. And the backend that will power all of this and make it possible is going to be discussed by my colleague, Moritz.
So my name is Maryam Moritz. I have a background in computer sciences, and I will talk about the data from a more technical perspective. And for doing this, I would like to introduce some ideas about games we had. And for doing this, I would very quick like to mention several main steps in producing a digital edition. So what you maybe would do at first is, if you want to have a digital representation of a book and you don't have it, you either have to scan or to OCR it, or if you don't have mechanisms that work very well already, you have to transcribe it. So the first step could be transcription and structural markup. A second step, if you want to have a translation for a work, you either have to translate it by yourself or have to look for some translations. So a second step could, for example, be aligned translations. A third step is maybe the linguistic annotation, because you want to enrich your data or your already digital corpus with linguistic or morpholinguistical information. And the fourth step could be identifying named entities within the text. So out of all these steps, you can imagine making some games. For example, giving a user who is not very experienced already, as an example for a transcription game, like a word, you already have the translation of it or the information about it. So the user only have to type it in for like practicing typing, like with captcha codes. A more experienced user maybe can identify a more critical word or sign of an OCR scan, and this gives you more information about your data. Example for an alignment game could be giving the user the text in his mother language, for example, a text or a sentence, and next to give him the text in ancient Greek and fill it what contains gaps. And the user has, for example, fill in the right form and translation, of course. Example for a linguistic, for a language game, could be giving a user a word in a given case, for example, with an adjective and an article in front, and the user has to transform it into another case or gender or yeah. And for a name game, for example, we can give the user a place name or a person in a given context, and he has to disambiguate what kind of city, for example, Alexandria, is meant in this context. So before I talk about the data in the background, I would like to mention some work in these fields, as I talked about the games already. So, for example, work in the area of OCR is done by Bruce Robertson and Federico Boschetti. So, example for alignment work and parallel text is, of course, Alpheus. An example for morpholinguistic annotation is done by Francesco Mambrini, who is also in the audience here. And Leif Isaacson and Elton Barker are working on named entity recognition. Sorry. So this is kind of also the base of data we are working with. What are we doing? We take the syntax, morphology, and alignment data, and after a very quick pre-processing step, we integrate them and store them. What brings us to the question, how would we store them, and how would our data backend look like, and what challenges do we have on the backend? So if we think about high functionality application, what we already realized from the talks before me. And we talk about several actions on data like reading, writing, updating, and performance issues. We maybe come up with a relational database because it's very functional or it's well developed. This is very first, very basic and very easy draft of our application, and it was like a first step in the model phase that we designed this so-called entity relationship model because it's very intuitive to adapt our problem in this way, like we would model a user or a submission or a word even as an entity, what you can see in the rectangles, and the relationships between them in these bubbles. But as I already said, this is very preliminary and very small. And if you want to make this to a relational database schema, then you have to make out of every entity and every relationship at least one table in the relational database scheme. This leads you to at least 30 or 40 tables even after the first draft. And when I started modeling this, like on paper, I gave up after 7 tables because I didn't like this idea. So another thing is if you want to change your functionality or change something on your model, you either have to rewrite the database totally or to put high effort into persistence and integrity. Yeah, what is not that easy. But so we at the end came up with the decision to use a graph. And the main advantage, for example, is that this model, what is really very easy, is already a graph. So we can build our graph already from this model. And we don't have to add some more effort in the modeling phase. So very quick, only the very formal properties of a graph. It contains out of entities and relationships. What were the rectangles before are now bubbles, and the relationships are just the arrows. And some also call the entities nodes, and the arrows in between the edges. Like in a social network, you would have the users would be nodes, and the friendship in between two person would be the friendship. So the main advantages are, of course, additivity, what I already talked about a little, and scalability. Just very quick, again, that the additivity as a main advantage of a graph more or less describes the fact that graphs are schema-free. This means if you have a kind of a database already used or set up, you can add additional data or additional functionality to your environment every time, and you don't have to think about planning details already at the beginning. So another main advantage of a graph is the performance, because while a relational database, if you have like a very complex system and you have many entries in your tables, because you have to deal with many data or much data, you want to look in a several depth of your application for some results, or you want to get back some entries, then you have to make joins over several huge tables, and this makes your application very slow. The graph query would just look for the property in the request. So, for example, in this example, for the user John, and don't matter how many users are in the database as well. It doesn't care. It just looks for submissions and slides that are related to the user John. So on this slide, I have a table from the graph database book, and of course, these figures are very optimistic. I cannot control them or verify them, but you can at least imagine that you run into several run sooner or later into several problems if you have a relational database bad designed, because on depth 3, I don't think that this is 1,500 seconds for a real-time application. Makes totally no sense. This is what I just very, very preliminary measured on my local machine, and it runs on a client, on a virtual client, and I made 3 measurements for only the depth of 2, and as you see on the records returned, they are growing in an exponential way. The execution time stays rather stable. Does everybody see? Below 1 second. So at the end, I would like to introduce some examples for queries. This is the cyber language, and the syntax is rather similar for those who know SQL. In the start node, you would declare the start node where the query looks from. The match clause is very easy because you see also in the small mini graph below that the match clause is kind of a mini graph. You identify your nodes and the relationships between them. And the where and the return statements are rather similar to SQL. So you say in the where clause what exactly, which properties and which values you are looking for and what you want to get returned. If you want to make the aggregation, you have to use the with statement, and in this example, I don't want to get back every word that is a verb, but also the whole sentence that contains these words, and so I have to match the first part of the query that contains maybe a verb with the second part of the query that returns every single word, because I want, of course, have the whole sentence and not only the verbs. So, and as the last example, this could actually be a real use case for our environment. Return every word of a sentence that contains at least one word with the part of speech property verb learned by the user John during the first week of the semester. And as I think you have to make like a join over 4 tables, and it would be very nested if you make this also in a SQL statement. And here again, you have only the subgraph, let's say, in the where clause that didn't fit on 1 line, so the date is on the 2nd line. And this is actually an example for our application, and this is also the end of my talk, and we are very grateful for being here, and thanks for your attention, and we are open for questions.